Star Trek games have been around practically as long as there have been home computers, and for nearly as long as the series itself. There had been barely any in the last few years though, until the recent Star Trek films brought fake Kirk and fake Spock to our screens, and then finally the 2013 game brought them to our computers. Out of keeping with the original series, but in keeping with the recent films, the game is a third-person shooter, where you take the role of either Kirk or Spock. Preferably it's a game to be played cooperatively with another player, otherwise whichever character you don't choose will have to be controlled by AI. The plot of the game has little to do with the films at all. Instead, they've decided to bring back, of all the creatures from the original Star Trek, the Gorn from the famous Arena episode. Perhaps they made this choice so that no matter how bad the graphics were, they can't make them look any more fake than they already did. It's a good job really, because the graphics feel a good few years behind the times for when it was released. The character models are particularly poor, and they're even weirder when you realise you can see inside your own head at times. And then there's Chief Engineer Simon Pegg's zombie here.
Port survivors off that vessel?
I like to think that nothing is
The environments generally feel quite empty too. There are often places where you can go off and explore other rooms, but there's never anything actually in them. Graphics aren't the most important thing, and a game can get around not looking amazing if the rest of the game is good, but it's just as dated everywhere else. The empty areas are just one indication of a level design that feels like it belongs in a game from a decade earlier. It uses a cover system which seems to be compulsory for every shooter since Gears of War. It works well enough, as does the combat generally, but again it feels like gameplay has developed a lot over the last few years, and this feels like it belongs in the past. It's distinctly average, and in some areas even worse. It has some very basic stealth elements, but they're practically worthless and at times virtually impossible in the areas where they'd be most of use. The phaser does have the traditional stun setting, but it's completely inaccurate to the TV show, and only slightly stuns people for a few seconds, and in order to knock them out completely you have to run up to them and hit them. It's just not Star Trek. Even worse are the platform sections. The game has rather clunky movement controls, and for some reason when it comes to sprinting, you can't just hold down the key before you run to do it like you can in every other game ever. Instead you have to start walking forward, then press the sprint key to go into a run before you can finally jump. Considering you're sometimes on a tiny platform and have to do this, it can be a bloody nightmare and lead to a period of constantly restarting at the last checkpoint to do the whole sequence again. It's some of the worst platforming this side of Tomb Raider. It's just so irritating.
Irritating? Ah, yes. One of your Earth emotions.
Other attempts to break up the gameplay don't do a great deal to help. There's a few places where you find yourself floating in space, and it's an excuse for another of those on-rails sequences, where you just move around to avoid objects. Yet again, it feels like a game that was designed in the 90s. The minigames for things like hacking and activating consoles aren't too frustrating at least, though they are trivial. You get ones where you just have to guide this moving line to the target point without touching the sides or crossing the path. Or these where you just have to find matching pairs of sound waves. Or the cooperative ones where together you have to get a sound wave to match the target wave. Quite what any of these have to do with the task at hand is never very clear. Generally though, this is a combat-focused game which doesn't feel very Star Trek, but then again neither did the recent films. As mentioned, the combat is fine, but doesn't stand out much beyond the basic level that you'd expect from a third-person shooter. There's a few different weapons, though nothing to get too excited about, with them mostly being different variations on phasers, and it doesn't really matter where you shoot anyone either. It's just a bare minimum shooter gameplay. Star Trek doesn't really make the most of the cooperative elements either. It at least works, unlike the broken mess that passed for co-op in Alien's Colonial Marines, but mostly the only places where it makes a difference are in doors that arbitrarily require two people to open, or the previously mentioned soundwave puzzles. And after opening doors together, neither player can actually move forward. You just get stuck in the doorway unless someone takes a few steps back. That's not the only bug either. The game is full of them. Mostly they're poor design but basically harmless, like the Vulcan body meld here, though occasionally they're more serious. In this bit I fell through the floor and continued to fall below the level until my friend finally reached the next checkpoint and the game brought me back up again. Another time when he joined the server as Spock, he didn't even have a gun. Spock was just holding out his empty hands like a child playing games. The only other feature worth noting is the tricorder, which you always have with you. It can allow you to see enemies through walls and hack things from a distance, but otherwise the only use is in locating and scanning various pointless collectibles. Well, they do actually give you XP to send in the game's upgrade system, but they are mildly useful at best. You also can only have one upgrade activated in each of these categories, and if you buy a new one, you have to choose between that and the previous one, but the game doesn't actually mention that, so I ended up wasting a lot of XP on skills it turned out I couldn't actually use together. The terrible design goes through all elements of the game too. For multiplayer you can only join a game at a checkpoint, but the game has to be started in order to invite the other player, which means that the only way to play cooperatively is to start a game, invite the other player, and then restart the checkpoint. Given credit where it's due, the game does load very quickly, and once we were in the multiplayer I never noticed any connection problems. Ultimately, Star Trek is a bare-bones third-person shooter that might just about pass as average if it wasn't for the poor graphics, terrible animations, clunky controls while requiring precision jumping, and numerous bugs up to and including one of the players turning invisible for several minutes. It's enough to make Spock leap off a bridge.
It is highly doubtful that either of us can cross unharmed.
As it is, with all these flaws, probably the best part of the game was the trailer.
Alright, now you're overacting.